I'm interim director of the South Asian Studies concentration, and I teach also in South Asian Studies and Religious Studies and Contemplative Studies at Brown. And it's just my pleasure to be able to chair this back from the field returning fellow presentations. I have a lot of engagement with undergraduates through my teaching and graduate students, and I know from those conversations and relationships, and also my role at the Saxena Center, how kind of vital and important to us at the center this fellowship program is. It's a real priority, and we always really try to encourage folks doing cutting-edge research at whatever level they're at in terms of their degree and progress to take advantage of this. And I'm just looking at the array of amazing projects. I can tell the fellowship program is really thriving. So it's going to be great for me to hear from you about how this all went, right? The ups and the downs, and what kind of potential there is for future progress and on your interests. And I think it's also going to be nice to hear from each other, right? Because to just find out what your peers and classmates and other folks who are really representing the next generation of research on South Asia are doing, what your ideas are, what some of your experiences have been like. So again, just really wanted to emphasize how grateful we are as a center that you all came to us to support your research, and how gratified we are that you undertook it with such diligence, and how excited we are to now hear about it and understand how we might support you going forward too. So welcome. A few small ground rules. You probably already know this. The way we're going to do this is we're going to go one fellow at a time in the order that's on the poster. Everyone will have about, strictly 10 minutes for your presentation, and then we'll take about 5 minutes for some discussion and Q&A. We'll just go after each presentation, we'll do a little Q&A, and then we'll go back to the next person. And so there are 7 presentations to get through, a pretty full schedule, so just be mindful of that. And in case you're wondering why I'm flashing numbers at you, it's just 5 minutes or 2 minutes in terms of timeline, just in case, because sometimes the pacing is hard to predict, and if you need a little prompting, I'll be there to kind of wave at you, okay? But that's it. Most of this is just kind of for us to make a discussion that we find fulfilling and get something out of. So I'll be relying on you too to engage with your peers' presentations and ask questions and find points of intersection, and I just really look forward to that, okay? So without further ado then, I would like to introduce our first returning fellow, Swetabh Changkakoti. And Swetabh was an intern at Data for India, a senior at Brown studying international and public affairs in the development track and computer science. Please, you come on up. And Swetabh worked with researchers, writers, and software developers at Data for India in the form of a data journalism internship involving data journalism, news engineering, and front-end software development. So, put your hands together. Welcome, Swetabh.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you for the introduction.
Of course.
And yeah, I guess like that cuts through a good part of the first part of the presentation, which was introduction. But just a little bit more context on like how like this specific internship came to be and why I chose to do this over the summer. So I'm a computer science and IAPA concentrator. I've spent a lot of time at Brown trying to find ways to be a CS concentrator while also contributing not as much harm in the ways that Brown CS can do, especially like coming out of college and working for companies that, for example, are working with military contractors and are currently giving have billion-dollar contracts with countries that make that are currently holding apartheid states and are perpetuating oppression over decades. So trying to reconcile that, I've tried to think about how I can be a computer scientist in responsible ways. And like a few different ways that I've tried has been like through labor organizing on campus, through like doing more typical like tech for good projects. But I think one area that I've been interested in for a long time has been journalism, and how software engineering and like computer science can help the area of journalism specifically. I've explored this through like one internship in the past where I was helping where I was a news engineering intern helping build like data infrastructure. And what felt missing from that internship was the fact that I was doing it in the US and not in the context that I'm like most comfortable with and the context that I care the most about. And yeah, that's like how this internship came about. So I worked with Data for India, and like this is if you look it up online, you won't find much about it because it's a small, very new nonprofit like aiming to make Indian data easier to understand, both for like researchers as well as the general public. So the team, it's a very unique kind of team, the kind of team that you wouldn't find like just generally. It has 3 data journalists and 3 engineers, and was founded by Rukmini S. and Akhil Wable. So Rukmini S. wrote the like wonderful book, like Whole Numbers and Half Truths, and came to Brown to give a like book talk on the same, on the same thing. And like I think recently when like Saxena Center had its book club series, this was also the first book on that series. And this was super inspiring. And following up with her like after her book talk is how I realized that I came to learn that this was work that was happening, and there was scope for like software engineering work to help journalism like in India. And that's how I got this internship. So because a software engineering internship technically like is kind of boring, and I'm sure people here have done much more interesting things. I just want to like go over the main points about like how like I tried to help, and generally like why this type of team can exist. So yeah, what can a software engineer do at a journalism nonprofit? So the obvious answer is a lot of data work. So like Data for India like kind of centralizes data from a bunch of different Indian surveys. You have the national sample surveys, like all of their rounds basically, the like Indian Human Development Survey, the NFHS, the Periodic Labor Force Survey, etc. So, and this data is hard to work with because to some extent it's messy, and a lot of this data lives in PDFs, and extracting this data, kind of like getting it in one place, storing it efficiently, and yeah, making sure that like it's easy to work with is difficult. And you can do this manually, and a lot of like research projects go about like doing this manually, like in that way where you write scripts for one particular data set, etc. But like kind of like a unique selling point of this nonprofit was that it kind of like harmonized stuff like state IDs, etc. across a lot of these data sets, and tried to like make it centrally available to the journalists working with them, so it's easier to handle. And this is a screenshot of the file structure of the data inside my computer, which is this also required some like modeling work in the backend. So Data for India has its own API, and so like modeling the data itself and like how we can efficiently get metadata, etc. from it was a big part of my work. Also like storing it efficiently, like Parquet files are better than CSV files for storage, etc. Like those are other technical details. And related to that is like building query tools. So making sure that when like journalists are exploring this data on the platform that Data for India has, it's easy to interact with. You can make like queries that are intuitive and make them quickly. So some optimizations on that end, and also like making sure that the way we're modeling data is like flexible and easy to extend. So as we, for example, add some like specific census data or like World Bank data, we don't have to completely like overhaul the the data representations we have on our backend to also accommodate for those. And this is just like on like an outline of what the data models look like. This is a screenshot from GitHub basically, but outlining that. And this is the overall kind of view that journalists were like at Data for India were using when like doing research for stories and interacting with this data. And like I contributed to a bunch of parts of this. For example, like do you see the tab on that says chart? Like, I have set up their like chart hosting infrastructure, and also like, yeah, as I'll talk about it, like just build some of their visualization infrastructure as well, and like viewing column metadata and like adding new columns, mapping existing data to like specific categories, etc. That's all like, yeah, pieces of the work I did. And yeah, so like a big part of this, and in fact like the way I started my work for this internship was by focusing on like data visualizations. And yeah, because clearly like if this is meant to be a platform that is accessible to the public and easily understandable, yeah, by like people with like the base requirements are like internet access, for example. At that point, like making sure that they have like accessible and very clear visualizations that they can easily like embed in other places and view on like different kinds of screens was important. And one of the reasons that we built a visualization software like in-house instead of using something like Data Wrapper was because of like the amount of flexibility it gave us. So like we can, yeah, like by building this like in-house, we could choose to represent this data as percentages versus as numbers. We could choose to add like specific filters to this that people could interact with. We could manually like change labels of things that like you can't see here. For example, if we were reading this with a screen reader, then we would be able to like very specifically like change what that 56% was read out as by a screen reader. And also like having like using our own software helped us connect like this visualizer to just all of the data that we had stored in the backend directly, instead of having to like upload like new files every time. So yeah, it is just like much more efficient to do it that way. And yeah, towards the latter half of my internship, I also started like acting not just as a software engineer, but as someone who's meant to use these tools. So I started doing some research in like using the IHDS, so Indian Human Development Survey, and like NSS, I think 78th round, data to to do research on like migration patterns within India and how that looks like across gender, caste, and class lines. So this was interesting because I previously worked directly with journalists as a software engineer, but I had not been a journalist and a software engineer at the same time doing this work. So like one of the reasons this was interesting was because as I like in the process of doing this, I like realized that there are certain features that would be super nice. For example, if yeah like if we wanted to like collapse, for example, states in like northeastern states into one category, then that's something that would be hard to do like just with the data itself. But I could build in a custom like column mapping feature that did that. The same goes for like if I wanted to view like the counts of a particular state while I was editing instead of like going directly into the data. Yeah, that's also a feature that I built into the like this thing from earlier. And yeah, so yeah, and that was mostly it. And overall, like the takeaways, they're just like these incredible people working like outside of large media houses in India, and like being freelance gives them like kind of the freedom to do so. Though finding funding structures for this is really hard, and you have to a lot of these like I guess freelance journalists do rely on like Western funding to some extent. I also learned about the details of many national data sets and the context behind them, like the IHDS, etc. And that tech and journalism can empower each other if they interact carefully. You can't just say, we're going to replace all journalists with AI, because that's not going to work. And you can't purely rely on like tech as a journalist to like give you correct answers. You have to, have a careful balance between the two. And finally, like I was in Chennai. It was really beautiful.
Excellent.
And yeah, but thank you so much.
Thank you. That was wonderful and perfect timing. Thank you for that very much. So, if you don't mind, you mind staying there to
yeah,
some
questions?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I should say also we will have a reception when all this is done, so please stick around for eat some food, and that should be an incentive to stay and listen. Maybe can I start with a question or two, and then we can open it up to the floor. I mean, fascinating to hear about this. I guess I'll just two things that I'd like to ask you about. First is maybe if you could give us a little bit of a sense of the kind of journalism project that your skills are supporting. You know, well, I know I get the data for India part, but the nature of that, of their journalism, the kind of advocacy it's doing, if that's the intent, or those kind of questions. And then the other question has to do with you mentioned that this is obviously a smaller operation, right? And that it's outside of these major media conglomerates, and that probably is necessary to do the kind of journalism they're doing, right? But do you feel like, is there any scope for getting support from the kind of existing tech infrastructure in data journalism at these bigger places to make your work more impactful? You know what I mean? Or do you have to kind of, reinvent the wheel, as it were, when you're at a smaller place?
Yeah. So yeah, I can answer both questions.
Yeah.
So first, I think when I was there, Rukmini and Abhishek, they were two of the journalists. They were writing two kinds of articles. One was more, if you have a very specific question about a particular data set, you writing a short kind of informational article explaining an answer to that question. And Rukmini's book, Whole Numbers and Half Truths, is kind of framed as in this very format where you have different topics and specific questions that she's answering. They also have longer form articles that kind of put together a bunch of different different data sets and different aspects of a topic, and kind of the work I was doing on migration was more along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and as for the second part, so Anushka's gonna talk about her data journalism internship later,
yeah.
And she was working at the Hindu, and they clearly have support for for this kind of visualization there, and also you have the advantage at larger media houses. My previous internship was at the Washington Post.
Mm-hmm.
You have a solid amount of tech support, funding, etc. going into this potentially.
Yeah.
And it's easier to kind of have infrastructure to host stuff, etc. But for given that we were a nonprofit outside of just one of these houses, what we relied a lot on open source software.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Our World in Data is a platform that basically does what Data for India is doing, but for UN Sustainable Development Goals and across the world, using a country as a unit instead of a state, or So their visualization software and their entire website was open source. So a lot of how we started building our own was by kind of forking theirs and seeing what we needed, what we didn't need, and how we could kind of adapt to those. And there are other communities I think Open News and Mozilla, and they have a lot of focus on building open source software for journalism, and that's big in the US. Thankfully there aren't solid huge borders on open source.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen as much of that within or from India itself. But yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. Any other questions for Swetabh, please?
I guess I'm just working with this publicly available national data and making it digestible seems very valuable. And I guess you talked about it in sort of that journalists would be the users, but do you think other researchers could use it too, or is it more targeted specifically at journalists?
Yeah. So the querying tool currently that I was talking about, that it isn't open source yet because the nonprofit isn't public yet. But I asked about this, and I think this is a goal where this would be a useful tool for I think a lot of researchers, and they are planning to at some point make this more widely available.
Cool. Other questions or comments? Well, it'll be interesting, Anushka, to connect some dots here. Yeah, please.
In terms of thinking about platform security and privacy concerns, especially dealing with sensitive data at a time when information is so quick to be weaponized in India especially, what were those considerations in terms of how are we going to protect potentially sensitive data?
Yeah, I think so. Honestly, good question. We weren't thinking about it a lot, and also because this is again all public data, and I know that the U.S. Census does a lot of work on differential privacy and anonymization. I don't I've seen PDFs online that have about PMAY grant recipients which have like their addresses and phone numbers on there, which is like clearly a violation. But I don't think any of the data that we have has any like personally identifiable information to that extent. But at least in terms of like name, address, etc. But yeah, it is something that I guess they should definitely think about going forward, or at least when they start interacting with data that's more sensitive.
Great. Well, thank you, Swetabh. That was excellent. Very, very interesting. Great. So let me, we're going to go now to our next speaker. Let me just help call that up. If I can. Oh, goodness. I'm a Mac user, so I may need some help from the next person to find it. But in the meantime, Arman, I'll introduce you, and maybe you can help me find your presentation. I do want to welcome Arman Deendar, and their project title is Archiving Regional Queer History, Historical Contemporary Sites of Queer Constructions of Self, Kinship, and Performance in Goa. And Arman is a junior at Brown, concentrating in history and computer science. Initially seeking to archive regional queer history, Arman's project's focus organically changed from the initial proposal as they navigated archives, sources, and contacts in India. And so the current title of their project is Anti-Colonial Resistance and Decolonization in Goa. So join me in welcoming Arman.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Professor Garrity.
Of course.
Yeah, so like my project title did change, and it actually changed again, as you can see.
Okay, cool.
But I'm trying to bring in a lot of different themes in relation to like regional history and also queerness. But before I begin my presentation, I think I have a responsibility as someone who worked on colonial history this summer to talk about the current genocide unfolding right before our eyes in Palestine. As we sit in the belly of the beast at an institution that directly profits from this ethnic cleansing project, we have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people and pressure our institution to commit to a ceasefire in Gaza, to divest from companies involved and profiting off of the military-industrial complex in Israel, and to urge our administration to protect the free speech of students. So I urge you all to read the demands and sign on to the open letter published by Students for Justice in Palestine and Palestine Solidarity Caucus. Ajeeb hai ye Goa ke log. Strange are the people of Goa. This quote is said to have been offered by Prime Minister Nehru in response to his Congress party losing the first major election in Goa in 1963. Instead, Goans electing a regional party. This quote comes after the fledgling Indian state under Nehru used armed action to incorporate the then Portuguese colony of Portuguese colony of Goa into the Indian state in December 1961. This military action has a widely contested historiography in India and Goa and in the world today, and it's remembered as a liberation of Goa, an invasion, an annexation, has many different terms depending on who you're asking and who you're speaking to. It incited international outcry in the 60s from the UN and NATO for India's use of force. What's interesting about this quote and why there's question marks is there's actually no textual evidence for this quote. It's thought to have been extrapolated from Nehru's address to India in 1962, but nonetheless, the phrase has become common language for Goan journalists, particularly in dealing with the complexities of Goan identity and where Goans might differ from, the nationalist construction of India. I open with this historical and archival conundrum to introduce my summer project because it tells us something important about what writing a queer regional history entails. Specifically in Goa, the importance of a queer belonging in this national sense, in that Goan identity does not fit into many standard conventions of Indian culture, which is common amongst many regions in India, which all have ambivalent ways of belonging and engaging with the state. This is where Goa is, by the way. So my motivations behind this project were deeply personal. My mother's side of the family is Goan, and we have strong connection to our Goan identity that exists in a myriad of manifestations, primarily food. So if you ever want to talk about going food, like, let me know. And also the work of many queer scholars and feminist writers, particularly Anjali Arundekar and Gayatri Gopinath, who Anjali Arundekar writes about the history of sexuality in Goa, particularly of a lower caste collectivity known as the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, which, and she invites in this scholarship an invitation into thinking with histories of caste and histories of sexuality as central to regional histories. Additionally, Gayatri Gopinath's work on queer diasporas introduces the concept of the queer regional imaginary, which, and I'm quoting from the book, from a supranational sense, instantiate alternate cartographies and spatial logics that allow histories of global affiliation and affinity to emerge. So with this theoretical background, my original project goal was to study both the history of queerness in early to middle 20th century Goa, driven by historical questions like when did modern modes of and categories of queer identification such as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender enter the vocabulary in Goa, and how do we contend with one, like globalized LGBTQ cultures, and two, imposing modern constructions and categories onto the study of the past. It also arose out of the focus in queer scholarship, primarily in South Asia, on the British encounter with sexuality, specifically the criminalization of hijras, who are contentiously constructed as India's third gender, transgender population, and Section 377, the criminalization of sodomy or same-sex activity by the British. So in terms of my actual research, I spent about a month and a half in Goa doing both an archival project on Goan queer history and also exploring contemporary queer scene in Goa. So since this is my first time working in non-English archives, and my Portuguese isn't great. I mean, I have some reading ability, but definitely was finding, the archival trace of like, oh, where was queerness in the 20th century was very daunting and seemed increasingly futile and too large of a project to engage in my limited time in Goa. But in spite of my frustration with the archive, I turned to the second half of my research project, which was the contemporary queer scene in Goa. And to talk about this queer scene, we need a little bit of background on how Goa is constructed today and how both the political, social, and economic economy operates. So in Goa, tourism is a huge part of the economy. 16% of the state's GDP goes to the tourism economy, and it equally exists in popular imagination in South Asia as the party destination. In fact, before embarking to Goa, people would ask me, of whom one is in this room, oh, what are you going to do in Goa? You're just going to party, kya, what are you going to do? And then I would always frustratingly respond, no, Goa has a history. It's worthy of academic study. But it's important to think about this, kind of social construction. Even in Bollywood films, Goa exists as this archetypical backdrop for the honeymoon. It's a place of inhibited sexual desire and freedom, distinct from the traditional heteronormative constrictions of Indian society. So with this kind of background on what Goa is as a place, a vibrant queer scene actually exists in Goa, which I was able to conduct oral histories of queer people in Goa, primarily through organizations and NGOs such as Queer Kinara Goa and Goa Rainbow Trust. And from these oral interviews, I found that a lot of the queer community in Goa is made up of new migrants to Goa, citing Goa's laid-back, carefree, kind of paradise-esque ethos in their decision to move there. In fact, Goa is also constructed as Rome of the East, or a kind of slice of Europe and India, which both plays into its tourist economy, and that it kind of presents itself as very liminal and a place to come to experience Europe and India. But as such, it also creates this kind of it has created a very vibrant queer community. In fact, within the queer community itself in Goa, there seems to exist a binary between visible queers who do not have familial roots in Goa, so the migrants that I was mostly interfacing with, and Queer Goans, who prefer less visible queer spaces and events. An organizer of the organization I was working with, Queer Kanagawa, tells me how event organizing is careful and attentive to this bifurcation of community. Friday nights are for queers who don't have the luxury to be visible for a variety of factors, class and familial background cited as major sources, and Saturday nights for themed parties and drag shows that also cater to the budding queer tourist economy in Goa. So in analyzing these oral histories, I found two things to be central here, right? Migration and labor. And they're central in the way that that in evolving and how my project is going to change in the future, I'm really interested in exploring these questions. So what all the Bollywood films fail to get at is that Goa's laid-back, paradise-esque ethos is actually erasing the exploitative migration, the exploitative labor of migrants that prop up the tourist economy. In Konkani, there's a word called susegar, which means kind of laid-back, carefree, right? But this erases also the history of caste oppression that Anjali Arundekar's work seeks to illuminate, and directly feeds the tourist industry and puts money into the pockets of wealthy North Indian, Russian, and upper caste Goan landowners and developers. So this question of migration is central to a lot of the regional political parties that are emerging in Goa, specifically the Revolutionary Goans Party, which has introduced a kind of Goan passport into legislation and runs on a nativist policy, protecting Goans, reserving their rights, reserving jobs, basically anti-migrant in every sense of the word. But here it's interesting because Goanhood and who is Goan is defined by if your ancestors lived in Goa when it was a Portuguese colony. So this connection to colonialism is strong in defining who is a Goan even today. So much like the policy of the Portuguese government, who also grants citizenship to Goans if they can prove that they had ancestors living in Goa when it was a Portuguese colony, this evidentiary regime privileges the upper castes with who had historically access to record keeping, birth certificates, literacy, and education.
Bring it to a close.
Yeah, almost done. So obviously the relationship to colonialism and regional belonging is troubling to me and opens up the question of how to construct a Goan identity that both embraces historical liminality and the plurality of Goanhood and Goans, and their inherent ajibness or strangeness in belonging to the nation. So in terms of, I'm almost done.
Please.
In terms of where my project is going in the future, it's turning to how like a pantheon of 20th century writers, particularly who I've highlighted here, Berta Menezes Braganza, who was a freedom fighter, an active member of the Communist Party, and wrote about Goanhood from a social relation, and specifically critiqued communalism and power not only by the Portuguese state, but also within Goa by elites. And so through this work and also through Anjali Arundekar's work, which came out in at the tail end of my time in Goa, I'm going to be using these sources to think with how to construct a history of regional belonging that is that disrupts normative constructions and power relationships. So to me, queer history here is both an invocation of sexuality, but more importantly, it's a notion of power.
Thank you, Arman. Excellent. Another very, very rich project. I'll start with a question. It was interesting to hear you talk about your frustrations with the physical textual archive, right? But then how that was kind of, you found the exact opposite when you were engaging with, maybe we'll call it an embodied archive of people, right? These oral histories. And so I'm curious how as you kind of proceed with that momentum, how that interacting with people can maybe help you be more targeted in your kind of textual archival search. And it sounds like you're already finding that, right? Basically like getting recommendations of people like, oh yeah, where to look, right, for the kind of stuff that serves your project. So I'm just wondering if you might care to expand on that a little and maybe give an example to a particular insights that you got from these conversations. I mean, you already gave us several, but love that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as a history student, I find at Brown, a lot of the history classes aren't presentist and that they're not thinking about, how does this history actually serve people?
Yeah.
So definitely I've made a lot of connections and sustained them from my time in Goa that are not relegated to like my family, right? Which was something really I'm really grateful for this project, right? Like I think the importance of transnational cultural organizing is super important. When you look at the history of liberation, it was always, the diaspora always played such an important role, right? But in terms of like actually, thinking about sources, thinking about like what is important to queer people in Goa today, I think a lot of it has to do with, like I was talking, migration policies and the use of state violence, particularly by the police.
I see.
If anyone has been to Goa, I don't know if you know, but the police are they don't like migrants, especially because like of the large tourist economy. A large way that they profit off of, tourism is through random stops and checks and things like that. So I think while like having the intention of doing archival research at the onset, I really learned more from, like you said, the community that is living today. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Thank you. Questions for Arman? Please. Yeah.
You mentioned an interest in the interaction between like queerness in Goa and Goan identity, and then like a more like Western or globalized ideas of like identity and terminology. Was there anything that you found there that you can speak about?
Yeah, for sure. So coming back to this drag performance, this is from a local Goan periodical called the Gomantak Times. But it's interesting. I was able to speak to some of these queens, and her name is Gia LaBeija. If anyone knows anything about kind of ballroom culture in the U.S., especially in the 1990s, the widely cited documentary Paris is Burning talks about this. But LaBeija is actually a character in. She was a person heavily involved in the nascent drag scene, nascent ballroom scene in New York in the 1990s. But it's interesting to see how these kind of cultural icons of Western queerness become, and Kareem Kubchandani talks a lot about this, become accented and become stylized in different contexts. And she also, in Goa, has a House of LaBeija where she teaches ballroom lessons and voguing lessons to people who are interested. But yeah, exactly, like there's this kind of like, accenting or like Indianized kind of version of queerness that is existing both like in relation to Black and brown queerness that in the US and its importation into different sites across the world.
Okay. We have time for one more question, I think. Please, yeah.
So you talked about this a little bit, but I'm kind of curious to hear how, with people that are not able to be like publicly out because of like family situations, class situations, how exactly are they able to engage with the queer scene in Goa?
Yeah, so this same organization that hosted this drag show, Queer Kinara Goa, they actually cater to different groups, right? So like I said, Friday nights are more for the DLs and Saturday nights are for the more visible queers, but the DL queers engage with queerness in a very kind of like secretive manner in if you know the history of cruising and how that operates under the radar, that's kind of the spaces that they are going to queer events for. So mainly not as much for community as much as an escape from the traditional nuclear family. And because a lot of these queer people are Goans themselves and who have family roots in Goa, not migrants, that's a main reason why they seek out these spaces, and why these spaces are so different.
Well, thank you, Arman. So let me invite our next returning fellow, Justin Dyer, up here to bring your paper up while I introduce you. Justin was an intern at Peak Sustainability Ventures. Justin's a junior at Brown studying environmental studies, economics, and Arabic language. And during Justin's internship at Peak, he worked on multiple projects addressing the lack of sustainability in hard-to-abate areas like steel. So looking forward to this. Thanks. Welcome.
Is this the clicker that works?
good question. We could give it a try. Yeah, maybe so.
Awesome. First, I'd like to thank everyone for being here and thank the Saxena Center for providing the opportunity. This is really amazing. And like Finn said, I was an intern at Peak Sustainability Ventures this summer in Mumbai. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, my name is Justin Dyer, and I'm from Marin County, California, which is just north of San Francisco. I'm a junior currently at Brown, and I'm studying economics and environmental studies on the sustainability and development track. I'm interested in the role that sustainable finance can play in the green transition, focusing specifically on private investment in early to growth stage companies. So you may be asking yourself, why Peak Ventures and why go to Mumbai to pursue this opportunity? Well, Peak's core mission is to address the issues of climate mitigation and adaptation. Unlike other firms, Peak doesn't think about climate as a sector or a theme. Rather, it is a way of thinking and evaluating any investment. These values align with the way that I think about the space too, which made it a perfect opportunity for me. Emerging markets is another space that I'm very interested in, given the development aspect of my studies. Also, the high growth rates of emerging economies pose an attractive investment opportunity, especially at early stages. The developing world is also responsible for about 63% of emissions today, and this number is expected to continue to grow as economies further industrialize. Although it is worth noting that the developed world is responsible for the majority of current atmospheric greenhouse gases. Impact-focused private investment can have an outsized role on carbon reduction while also greatly contributing to economic development. Early-stage investing is risky, but can also be very rewarding. The space is interpersonal and intellectually demanding, which I found to be my two favorite aspects of the job. Peak is a smaller office, and that relies on strong partnerships to facilitate and source deals. The lean nature of the team meant that there was opportunity to work on multiple projects within the firm and receive one-on-one mentorship. Also, it meant that I was able to research and map out investment theses within different sectors, providing me, an intern, the opportunity to be a thought leader within the firm. All in all, this made for a once-in-a-lifetime internship experience. So now to tell you a little bit about my work, the main projects I focused on were in steel, carbon markets, and direct air capture. So one of the sectors that I focused on was steel. And as Finn said, steel is broadly known as a hard-to-abate sector due to its reliance on coal and its multi-step value chain. Steel will also continue to be a vital material for Indian development as construction and transportation demand continues to expand. Currently, steel accounts for about 12% of national emissions, and this number is only expected to continue growing. Through my research, I found that carbon capture and storage, as well as hydrogen, are the two most prevalent opportunities for investment in the space. Hydrogen is capital intensive, but it is much cleaner, and it provides a permanent solution. Whereas carbon capture and storage is much less expensive, but it acts as only a point source solution, being put in at the very end of the process in the value chain, whereas hydrogen is very early. Without government mandates, it is unlikely that either technology will achieve scale. Now moving on to carbon markets, they are seen as a vital tool for achieving decarbonization. They provide a means for purchasing offsets and are foundational for us reaching net zero goals. It is difficult to discern one carbon marketplace from another and to see if one really has a competitive advantage. This is largely due to their proprietary technologies. A lot of these companies are set up as software as a service businesses, so it really comes down to which product has the best APIs, who has the best investors, and the strongest corporate partnerships. These marketplaces audit carbon credit projects and ensure that factors like additionality and traceability are provided, while preventing things like leakage, which are just terminologies within the space. Carbon markets seem to be at an inflection point in their lifespan, and it'll be interesting to see how the space matures from here. But all in all, it's too early to tell. And finally, moving on to direct air capture, DAC is an interesting space because it is a technology with heavy investment and little returns. It costs an exuberant amount of money to build and operate, especially when you consider it per ton of CO2 that it captures. Thus, the unit economics must improve if direct air capture is to perform at scale. This problem is largely due to the fact that carbon is a public good, and it represents a, quote, tragedy of the commons scenario. And thus, it begs the question, who will internalize the cost of this carbon? To be most effective, in my opinion, direct air capture must rely on permanent storage rather than reuse and re-emission of the captured carbon. Because if you're doing that, then it kind of just defeats the purpose. And then moving on to some of the things that I was able to do in India outside of my work. The first main tenet was rugby. Outside of work, I was able to explore the city and pursue my hobbies. I'm a member of the Brown Men's Rugby Club, and while I was there, I played after work and over the weekends with Bombay Gymkhana. It was an awesome experience to meet other people who share a common interest with me, and I even got to play in a match against the Maharashtra State Police. And I found the community to be incredibly inviting and just an awesome group of people, so that was really one of the highlights of my trip. I also was able to travel on one of the long weekends, and I went to Jaipur and Agra with with a fellow intern. We were able to see historic sites and experience India outside of Mumbai. This was another one of my favorite parts of the fellowship. But I would have to say that my favorite hobby was exploring local restaurants and street food. It's fair to say that after having my first masala omelet, I was hooked. Not to mention the dosa cart outside my office, which fueled me Monday through Saturday. Although I found food to be some of the best, the coffee was even better. And then for some highlights, one of the biggest highlights of my experience was actually working towards impact and pursuing a topic that I'm really genuinely passionate about. This internship was an incredible opportunity and experience. I was able to meet new people from all over the world that I was able to share lifelong memories with, and that is irreplaceable. The fellowship provided infinite chances for me to try new things and push myself outside of my comfort zone. These experiences have broadened my perspective and expanded my worldview. It has impacted the way that I think about academic and social issues alike. And then considering further study and what I'd like to do with this project in the future, for my future plans, I'm going to continue to pursue an honors thesis in this topic that is based on the work that I was able to do in India. And this will allow me to further pursue my interest in the space and build upon the experiences that I've had. After Brown, I'm also considering pursuing a graduate degree that will further explore sustainability and development, while actively recruiting and seeking opportunities to continue working in the investing space. And with that being said, I'd like to open up for questions.
Thanks so much, and very interesting detail to hear about your rugby talent as well. Can you reflect at all on the did you come face to face with some of the differences of in green venture capital, let's say in North America versus India and South Asia? Because as you reflected, a lot of the problems that this is addressing are in some ways, could be directly laid at the feet of North America and Europe and big polluters. So I'm just kind of curious how the different regional focus changes the business and the way people think about these questions.
I think there's multiple ways to approach that question, but the first one is kind of the breakdown of investors in the space. You have people like Breakthrough Energy, which is backed by Microsoft, one of the biggest corporations in the world, and it seems kind of like they have endless resources to address these problems. But also Peak was investing kind of on a global scale with an India focus.
I see.
So you'd have companies from, say, with green steel, for example, a large focus on the Nordic regions, because Sweden is a big innovator in green steel. But then you see their biggest investors are Shell Corporation or Breakthrough Energy, which is backed by Microsoft, or some of the bigger venture capital firms in North America, which made it kind of difficult for a smaller firm with less resources to really enter in on those deals. So I guess one way that they did approach that is locally sourcing these deals and using partnerships within the country to spur kind of the entrepreneurship and innovative scene and market within India itself.
Okay.
So having those calls with local entrepreneurs were some of the best ones.
I see. Interesting. Gotcha. So there's in a way there's a problem with the globalized nature of our economy, right, in terms of competition and scale. But you're saying they can kind of make common cause with the Indian scene.
Yeah, and it can be kind of difficult as well for those bigger players to enter into the Indian geography just because they're not so familiar with it.
Of course.
So that's where firms like Peak can really play a larger role too.
Okay. Very cool. Other questions for Justin? Please, Michael, and then, yeah.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I guess I'm really interested in the green steel. First of all, that steel just by itself is 12% of emissions. It's kind of crazy for it to be just like one product. That's such a high percentage. And so I guess I was wondering if you could just, I'm just curious, like what is it about the steel production process that makes it so emissions intense? And also whether you think it like, does producing a ton of steel cause more emissions in the US or India? Just curious if there's any differences.
I guess the first main factor that causes such high amount of emissions is that steel is heavily energy intense, so it requires coking coal, which is like some of the dirtiest coal, and coal is one of the dirtiest fossil fuels. So per metric ton of steel produced, there's actually like 2.5 gigatons of CO2 put into the atmosphere, which is a huge number. And all throughout the value chain as well, there's like more emissions, and that doesn't even account for like land degradation or waterway degradation from other like factors of pollution. That's just carbon. And so like talking about hydrogen, for example, hydrogen energy can be harnessed to actually like smelt the fuel and put it into a furnace instead of using coal as a resource. So those are like different adaptations and mitigations that people are exploring in the space.
Please, yeah.
Hi, it was really great to hear your presentation, and I am interested in both the finance aspect of the work you're doing, but also, given that you were in India, I am curious to know what the discourse is around equity looked like, whether that was present and whether that felt different to you compared to how those conversations occurred in the US when you were there doing this internship.
Sure. I mean, from personal experience, I haven't had like a real corporate environment job yet within the US, so I can't speak so much on that front. But within my team, I mean, we were pretty diverse from like a gender spectrum. There are like multiple females working in the office as well as men. And then from like an equity standpoint, do you want to kind of elaborate on that? Whether you?
Yeah, I meant around like environmental equity and environmental justice when you do climate finance work, and whether those conversations occurred and what that discourse looked like within your workspace.
Sure. So like the mission statement of the firm is that they can only invest in like environmental products. So for example, one investment that they were considering is a company that uses solar energy to fuel like oil rigs. But even though that emissions would have gone towards like natural gas to actually power the rigs, and instead they were replacing it with renewable energy, they said, okay, well since it's end all be all net going to emit further carbon, we're not going to invest in the company, even though they're providing like a renewable energy source for drilling.
Right.
If that kind of makes more sense. Sorry, I don't know if that totally addressed your question.
No, that's great.
Okay.
Yeah, please, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you for your speech and presentation. I was wondering, what was the biggest cultural difference or similarity that you noticed coming from America to India, spending the summer there?
I guess if I could point to one specific example, and just because it happened so frequently, it was like crossing the street was crazy. And like getting to my office, I would get like dropped off across the street, and it was like right on a highway. And there was like no crosswalk or like zebra crossing. So I would just have to like jump out in front of cars and like dodge side to side to kind of get to my office. So I guess that's like one of the bigger, and you can kind of take that and put it on like a macro scale, but that's kind of like one of the cultural differences that I really noticed.
Yeah, last question, please.
Thanks for your speech. We were just wondering, how was Indian rugby? Was that a good experience?
It was a good time, a lot of good guys there.
Right on. Very good. Well, thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
All right, so moving on and returning the conversation to data journalism, I'd like to welcome Anushka Kataruka. All right, got some fans in the house. Who is a data journalism intern at the Hindu. Anushka is a senior at Brown studying international and public affairs, development track, and economics. And Anushka undertook a data journalism internship for the Hindu with their data team in Chennai, doing day-to-day work in data journalism and technology assistance. So, welcome, Anushka.
Thank you. I just want to also thank the Saxena Center for this opportunity and for the money. Um, so I just want to start off with saying, so I was doing data journalism, as Professor Greddy said, in India, specifically in Chennai, which is in South India, same place as Swetabh. But I was working at The Hindu, which is a really old national Indian news organization. It's called, I want to clarify about the name, it's called The Hindu, it's not Hindutva right wing. It's just called The Hindu, it's just like an old name, but they didn't change it. So I think they're one of the first media organizations which have started doing data journalism in India, and then like other organizations started picking up, but not really. It's still, the team is quite strong. In fact, like Rukmini S, who sort of worked with in the summer, also used to work at The Hindu. So when I was at The Hindu, that was just kind of our office. This was one of my co-interns. She was also my school friend, but it was just nice working in the office. And this is just a screenshot from like the WhatsApp group chat where we would have like a lot of communication, because there was one very rainy day where we had to go in, but then my boss didn't come in, and So basically, what I was doing was kind of going over, collecting a lot of data, trying to make the data like really accessible and easy to portray for stories, and overall like kind of, they didn't have a lot of people who could actually code on their team, and so they kind of took me being there as an opportunity to essentially like streamline a lot of processes to like especially like display a lot of data. So there were two projects that we did with specifically like IMD data. So IMD is the Indian Meteorological Department, which gives like weather data on a daily basis. So on the actual website, it's a really bad website. It only gives you like the weather data from like that means temperatures and rainfall data for like the last 2 days or something, but there's no way to get data from historical weather data at all. So, but there's a library, like a Python library that existed, which I could extract like every day's temperature and rainfall data from 1952 to now. So every single day, like it's now like in this massive database that they have, which I had to extract. So one story that we did was, because it got really hot in Chennai and overall like in different parts of India, we did how like comparing this June to all previous Junes since 1950, and seeing like how extreme the temperatures of that June was. And we found that there were a lot of extreme temperatures, specifically like, especially like Thēvāram had like the hottest June it had seen since like independence at least. And many other places had like very, like even Chennai, if you see like all the red dots are the ones that are for this year, and the rest of the gray are like for previous years. So you see like it's more towards the right now, and it's not like according to average. In a similar way, we did like rainfall and floods in North India. So in July, I don't know if people were following news of India in July. There was a lot going on aside from the violence in Manipur, but at the same time there was also these massive floods happening in Himachal Pradesh, Punjab, and these areas, and a lot of people lost their lives and homes and livelihoods, and even entire highways were completely wrecked. So we were kind of measuring overall the amount of rainfall that was, and flood levels that were coming out using this data, and we see that according to this graphic, like again this July had like some of like the highest rainfalls that had ever been seen overall in a lot of these places where the flooding happened. And I think that's just kind of cumulative rainfall data. Sorry, this entire presentation is gonna be a lot of graphs. I'm just gonna go through each story. So this one was a huge project that we kind of undertook. It took like 2 weeks to do it. It involved machine learning and kind of relying a lot on this one study as well. The authors of the study, I think Rochna Chaturvedi and one other person, they came up with this machine learning algorithm. So for background, in South Asia, specifically, especially in India, names can say a lot about what your status is in society, like in terms of like religion and caste especially, and so that can be reflective just in terms of like probability of like how people will treat you, what kind of like socioeconomic position you kind of capture in India. So what we did was, because for all members of parliament or members of like the legislative assemblies overall in different states and even in the central government, there every single person who has either run for member of parliament or is one, there is no data on like what their religious identity actually is. And in the current political situation in India, like with the rise of communalism and polarization, it was very imperative to see like how Muslim representation specifically is seen in India. So what we did was we came up with this natural language processing model, which was kind of inspired by the study, and like using using like n-grams, and it's a lot of like technical technical terms, but like basically like a machine learning algorithm which first learned on this database, which was known as the it was like some rural development survey across like 10 states in India, and with like names and religion, and so learning from that, like, oh, so these names maybe can infer this religion, and using that to like then running the data on like all the MPs who have ever been elected to the Indian Parliament, and predicting their religion technically, because we don't have official data on that. So once we ran, this took 2 weeks to do, because we had to do a lot of manual checking as well, because if there were errors, that would be because assigning religion in itself can be quite problematic. So what we did, we had to like go through it manually as well, especially for like vague names that we didn't really know could be assigned. And like there were also issues with assigning, again, giving that assignment of an identity, especially in states where the survey, which was the training data, were like, MPs from those states, it was like difficult to assign, especially like, for example, like states in the Northeast, or like smaller states like Goa and stuff like that. So it was hard to kind of assign, so that's why we also had to like do a lot of manual checks. This project got a lot of, I was gonna say clout. It got a lot of attention from different like academics across India once like the article was released. This was kind of like someone tweeted about it, and if you see like Asaduddin Owaisi, he's like the leader of the Indian Muslim League, which is like the biggest Indian Muslims party and in India, and he's a huge voice in the opposition coalition overall. So we saw that like there were zero Muslim MPs from many states. Like these states have never elected a Muslim MP before, even though they have like significant Muslim populations. And we also see overall, like this is like overall the proportion of parliament which has had Muslim representation in India. At this point, you see how it's like gone down. It was like the highest in the 80s. So regardless of like, even like even if you compare like Congress and BJP, which are the two biggest parties in India, it has like significantly gone down. And BJP is just like, this is like one person each, by the way. Like it's just one, like I was surprised to find that level as well, but yeah. And then
2 minutes left.
Sorry. Oh, just 2 minutes? Yeah. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I'm gonna rush through, and this is also like more graphs on this. This is just like a break in the middle, like it was just like food in Chennai and like other things in Tamil Nadu. This was another, we got like this data on like there was a lot of political violence going on in like specifically like states like Bengal and Manipur or in July because there were elections going on, especially like rural polls in Bengal, and so we saw how much of like there's like deaths and overall like instances of violence happening. We got this from like the ACLED, which is another like they collect this data for all around the world. It's based in the United States actually. And yeah, we got state-wise data. This one black line that you see is the 2019 election, and we see in like most states the violence just really like rose up during the 2019 election itself. And this is just overall like specifically, I think, incidents of violence and like and deaths due to political violence in Bengal. another piece that we covered was overall over care work in India, like, and the division between like women and men, and how much of like time, how much time they dedicate to care work. So we see like the differences. It's always like it's very consistently skewed, and like women are dedicating way more time, regardless of like, even we came up with charts of like caste and even economic status. Even then, that was the same proportion, like there was no change, which was also frankly a little surprising. This is very interesting because if you see widow, divorced / separated men contribute the most to care work. Okay. But that was just like an interesting data point. But this was also huge because for this, I had to really push for this article, but this was just combining different sources from the World Bank, IMF, UN, etc., and trying to come up with showing how like there's like an inequity in climate finance overall, and in terms of just debt. So this is showing overall carbon emissions per capita from each country / region. You see UAE and US are way above the average, and this is the target emissions that everyone is trying to reach. India is like way below it. China is consistently rising, and that's overall like climate percentages as percentage of GDP of each region. And we see that Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia have like a huge amount of proportion that they dedicate to like climate finance, versus like the US and Canada and Western Europe, it's quite low, honestly, and which is quite concerning considering their huge historical and current contribution to GDP. Then. Yeah, this is the last one. And then this one overall shows like total approved funds towards each region. And this is very interesting because it shows like how climate vulnerable a country is, and at the same time like how much of debt distress they have. So you will see that like in Sub-Saharan Africa especially, like they have like high level of like climate vulnerability, but at the same time are in debt distress, which is to some extent unfair because these are the countries which have been contributing least to the climate problem, but at the same time they are the ones who are like being basically like broken down under debt. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, that's kind of like everything that we did. This was like a music festival we went to in Chennai. I stayed with a lady over the summer. She was like just subletting her room to me. Yeah, and that was Pride in Chennai.
Excellent.
But, yeah.
Thank you, Anushka. I mean, another incredibly rich presentation. I'll start off with a question of your experience of data journalism, because I'm struck how in each of the slides you show us that in a way that and the culmination of a process going from like numbers, like a data set, to like a narrative of some kind, right? Like an article that someone can tweet about, or a visual representation. So can you talk a little bit about that workflow from the inside in the newsroom? Like how do you go from numbers to an impactful narrative that people can really like get quickly and share?
So sometimes it starts with like finding like, oh, I want to see the relationship between like these different variables and stuff. So it wasn't necessarily always like, oh, I came across a database, let's analyze it.
Gotcha.
It was more of, oh, I'm considering like this aspect. Like for example, like the Muslim representation one was actually like, this idea was something that my boss was actually like sitting on for apparently several years, and then he was like, oh, you can code, you can do this for me. But it was mostly just that. But it was just like ideas of like, oh, we have like there's something that we're seeing in the country through our own eyes, but then how do we like quantify it, and how do we like see it like in terms of data, like is it actually true? Because I feel like a lot of Indian data is just kind of nested within multiple different government websites. It's so hard to extract, and also half of it is in PDFs, which makes it way more hard to kind of make it more accessible. Like no one's gonna go through like 300-page PDF to find like a single data table.
Right.
So that's why like I think like having some more clarity. That's why like I feel like data journalism in India is like a huge budding area that someone
Yeah.
can get into, but yeah,
Thank you
if
for
that
that.
answers
Yeah,
your
what's
question.
interesting, and especially, as Swetabh said this too, the problem of PDFs as a format, right, for this, in this niche. I'd like you to clean up my desktop too, you get some good techniques. Any questions here for our speaker? Yeah, please, Swetabh.
Yeah, like, amazing presentation. Do you think that, like, there's a difference in safety levels for journalists who are kind of like approaching the same narratives from like a data journalism perspective versus from like, yeah, just different approaches or like different?
I definitely think that being like, backing things up with data is a lot safer in some ways for journalists than like doing like on-ground reporting, which is really sad because the on-ground reporting is also like extremely important, but that's kind of part of the reason why I've been considering data journalism in India as well, because like just because of like the safety concerns as well. But yeah, I think there is like a perception of like, oh, she's speaking through data. They are speaking through data, and so there's no like compulsion to like, oh, whatever you're saying is false, or like there's no like way to like have like a counter narrative if you're like actually backing whatever you're saying with data. So I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
Other question, please, yeah.
As far as your responsibilities were concerned, did you have to go collect the data and then make the graphs and then write the report? What exactly was how much were you involved? These are excellent graphs. Did you create these?
Yes, so it was especially in the data front, it was everything from start to finish. So scraping it, collecting it, analyzing it, in this case doing like the machine learning algorithm and stuff, even like cleaning it in later stages and then visualizing, all of that was done by like interns, and like I like all the projects that I showed, like all of that is done by me. To some extent also like even the writing of the articles was done by me. Some of the boss, so he would just edit and write things on his own by himself. So yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Any other time for one more question, please?
I really liked seeing your presentation, and I think like data in the global south is definitely, there's a lot of conversations around equity of like even availability of data, or even you mentioned that like it was an America-based firm that, was being used for like extrapolating your data. So I'm wondering what your experience was and whether it was difficult finding data on certain topics that like, might not be in the government's radar, or like might be only coming in from institutions that are outside, and like how that impacted them.
So the thing is like, especially like with the Hindus data team, they mostly just rely on government sources because those are the most trusted ones. Because data is such a like vague, it's hard to kind of collect, it's hard to like, corroborate all of that. That way it's like very, like the one conflict data that I showed, like that's like the only data set that I could find. For example, like if I want to understand like how political violence works out, if you see like there's half of Kashmir were just excluded from this, but like Kashmir is also like whichever states are like extremely red, those are the ones with the highest levels of political violence. Like otherwise it's mostly just relying on government data because of like even equity concerns, because despite everything, like the government is quite rigorous to some extent in collecting data. Also, there are a lot of biases you find within data collection as well, like the way they define gender, the way they define caste, all of that. Like there are issues with that. But we just can work with what we have at this point. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Anushka. And I'd like to invite our next speaker down, Hamsa Shanmugam. Bravo, welcome. And Hamsa's project is called Thēvāram, a musicological analysis. And Hamsa is a senior at Brown studying music and health and human biology. Hamsa is a Carnatic musician and music concentrator with an academic focus in world music and ethnomusicology, specifically South Indian classical music. The current project includes this musicological analysis of Thēvāram, and Hamsa spent the summer learning from Sadhguru Nathan Odavar, a leading Thēvāram scholar and the designated temple singer of the Kapalishvara temple in Mylapore, Chennai. So, welcome.
Thank you. All right. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Hamsa. I study music and health and human biology, and this summer what I was doing through the Saxena Center Fellowship was learning Thēvāram, which is a form of Tamil Saiva devotional music. So a lot of learning directly and a lot of looking at archives as well. Okay. So I am going to zoom through the presentation so that I have time at the end to sing, because I feel like this presentation, given that I spent 99% of my summer singing, this presentation would not be complete if I didn't leave time for that. Okay, so the history. Thēvāram refers to the compositions of 3 Tamil poet saints, namely Tirunjana Sambandar, Tirunavukarasar, and Sundarar. This photo I took at the Kapalishvara temple, so you can see the 3 of them as the first 3, and then the 4th figure that you see is Manikavasagar, who is the composer of Thiruvasagam, which is a related form of Tamil Saiva devotional music. So Thēvāram was composed in the 7th and 8th centuries, but was mostly lost. There wasn't really too much of a written record until the 11th century, when Rajaraja Cholan, who was a Chola dynasty king, commissioned for Nambi Andar Nambi to compile Thēvāram scriptures into the Pannira Tirumurai, which is a 12-volume work. And of these 12 volumes, the first 7 volumes were composed of the Thēvāram compositions. So total, what we have right now, this is not the full number because there was no written record until the 11th century. So a lot of Thēvāram scriptures were lost, but what we have now is a total of 8,284 songs that are grouped into 796 padigams, padigam meaning a record, and this is a grouping of 10 to 11 songs across the 7 volumes of Thēvāram. So in the 13th century, Thēvāram was incorporated into Saiva Siddhanta philosophy by the Adinams, which are Saiva monasteries in the southern part of India. Currently, Thēvāram continues to be preserved by Oduvars, who are temple singers that chant Thēvāram in Saiva temples and propagate this music through the oral tradition. I have a little clip that I want to play, and hopefully it will work, so you can see what exactly this looks like. Hopefully this works. Okay, you know what, if it doesn't work, that's okay. We're not going to waste more time on this. But the last point that I wanted to touch upon on this slide is that Thēvāram is an important precursor to Carnatic music, which is South Indian classical music. And this is of particular interest to me because I am a Carnatic musician, a vocalist and violinist by training. Okay, so what I was doing this summer, let's dive into the musicological characteristics of Thēvāram a little bit. So first we have Pan, which refers to melodic frameworks that incorporate specific notes and nuances that accompany these notes. They are analogous to ragams within Carnatic music. And then we have katrales, which are rhythmic sequences that padigams will follow. And this is somewhat analogous to talam in Carnatic music, but not quite. You can think of it more as like katrales are patterns that the rhythm will follow, whereas like talam is a more like structured form of rhythm and meter in Carnatic music. Another characteristic is that each padigam, each grouping of 10 to 11 songs, is composed at a specific sthalam or holy site. And so this is specific to the deities at this temple, so the form of Shiva or Parvati that reside at this temple. The last point is that my guru would say that Thēvāram is not patu, it is mantram, meaning that Thēvāram cannot be seen as just songs, right? Thēvāram is a musical form, but it has an inherent religious, devotional, spiritual component to it. And so when learning Thēvāram, when singing Thēvāram, and when studying Thēvāram from a musicological perspective, it's important not to get lost in the musical components without treating the lyrical and devotional content with the same importance, which is an important consideration for me as I continue my work with Thēvāram and musicology of it. Okay, so what I was doing this summer, a lot of collecting archives, but 90% of what I was doing was learning Thēvāram directly from Sadhguru Nathan Oduvar, who is the hereditary temple singer who is appointed at the Kapaleswara temple in Mylapore, Chennai. And this temple is a very important temple. It's actually one of the, it's a temple that is revered within Thēvāram scripture. So this was a huge opportunity, and I'm like eternally grateful to the Saxena Center for making it happen. Over the course of the summer, we covered all the 23 puns, so 23 melodic frameworks that are used within Thēvāram. There is a total of about 108 puns, but 23 of them are used within Thēvāram. Okay. Future directions this December, again through the Saxena Center's support, I will be attending the Tamil Nisai Sangam's Pan Nisai research conference in December. So this will be a great opportunity for me to interact with experts in both Carnatic music and Thēvāram, and participate in discussions surrounding the relationships, particularly between Pan and Ragas, which is particularly important to me because this is what I'm writing my thesis on for music. I hope to compare Thēvāram puns and Carnatic ragams to provide a musicological analysis of Thēvāram from a Carnatic perspective. All right. So I'm going to be singing the very first Thēvāram. You can see on the left here is a notation that I found in a book. I believe was written in like the 1970s or 80s by a Carnatic musician. So this is a very bare bones Tamil notation. It's not particularly useful, but I thought it was interesting. And then on the right is the notation that I wrote when I learned the song orally over the summer. And you can see that I always make a point of when I write my notations, I write them in English, and if it's a Tamil song, then I write it in Tamil as well. So. தோடுடைய செவியன் விடையேறியோர் தூவன் மதிசூடி தோடுடைய செவியன் விடையேறியோர் தூவன் மதிசூடி காடுடைய சுடலை பொடி பூசியன் உள்ளம் கவர்கள்வன் தோடுடைய செவியன் விடையேறியோர் தூவன் மதிசூடி காடுடைய சுடலை பொடி பூசியன் உள்ளம் கவர்கள்வன் ஏடுடைய மலரான் முனை நாட்பணின் தேத்த அருள் செய்த ஏடுடைய மலரான் முனை நாட்பணிந்தேத்த அருள் செய்த பீடுடைய பிரமாபுரமேவிய பெம்மான் இவன் அன்றே ஏடுடைய மலரான் முனை நாட்பணிந்தேத்த அருள் செய்த பீடுடைய பிரமாபுரமேவிய பெம்மான் இவன் அன்றே அருணெறிய மறைவல்ல முனியகன் பொய்கை அலர்மேய அருணெறிய மறைவல்ல முனியகன் பொய்கை அலர்மேய பெருநெறிய பிரமாபுரமேவிய பெம்மான் இவன் தன்னை அருணெறிய மறைவல்ல முனியகன் பொய்கை அலர்மேய பெருநெறிய பிரமாபுரமேவிய பெம்மான் இவன் தன்னை
மனம் வைத்துணர் ஞான சம்பந்தன் உரை செய்த ஒரு நெறிய மனம் வைத்துணர் ஞான சம்பந்தன் உரை செய்த திருநெறிய தமிழ் வல்லவர் தொல்வினை தீர்தல் எளிதாமே திருநெறிய தமிழ் வல்லவர் தொல்வினை தீர்தல் எளிதாமே
Wonderful, and thank you for that amazing demonstration. Really appreciate
Thank you
it.
so
Really,
much.
really brings it all to life, you know, as your pictures did too. As someone who spent a lot of my time doing research on mantra, I can't resist but dig into that
Yeah,
little
absolutely.
expression. Do you have the sense, this statement that it's not bhakti, it's mantram, is that mean that basically that the Thēvāram songs have the kind of status in terms of revelation that mantras
Yeah.
do, rather than existing traditional mantras being incorporated as lyrics into Thēvāram?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of both
Okay.
actually. And I think to answer this question, we can dig into how like some of the content of Thēvāram itself. So within Thēvāram, there is a heavy emphasis on the mantram Om Namah Shivaya.
Mhm.
So this is called the Anjadithu, which means 5 letters. So
Mhm.
Om Namah Shivaya is 5 letters, and this is a mantram that is used within Thēvāram. So there's mantrams that exist within Thēvāram, but also Thēvāram itself is revered as a mantram. It is often called the Tamil Veda, given that like, you know, the Vedas are in Sanskrit, but for Tamil people, especially within the Saiva denomination of Hinduism, Thēvāram is something that is revered to that extent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Questions for Hamsa?
Yeah.
So I was wondering that the Carnatic music is played within the various temples in devotion to the Shaivites.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Thēvāram is not Carnatic music. These are two distinct, different genres of music. Thēvāram is a devotional form of music. Carnatic music is classical. So there are different origins, and Thēvāram, like, I think one key difference is that with Carnatic music, the music comes first, right? The compositions are there, and they're, like, we sing compositions within Carnatic music, but at the end of the day, the focus is on the musicality of it. So if you have to make some compromises with the way that you split up the words, such that if you have to take a breath in the middle of a word, in Carnatic music, that's okay, because the music comes first. In Thēvāram, you cannot do that. Like, the lyrical content is a lot more important than the music, and the music is definitely supplementary to the devotional content and the lyrical content of it, and it, you know, like, it makes the lyrical content shine, but the devotional part of Thēvāram is the most important part of it. Yeah.
And so it's written in Tamil?
Yes.
Please.
Wait. Okay. You can go first, and then I'll get to Amma, hopefully, if we have time.
Please, Arman. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we'll come to Siddhartha.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Always amazing to hear you sing, Hamsa. So I'm wondering a little bit about like the histories of caste behind
Yeah.
Thēvāram, right? Like usually like we've talked about before, like
Absolutely.
you learn from the Devdasi tradition and what history there is here.
Yeah, so with Carnatic music, there's a very rich Devadasi tradition there. This is a little different. So the composers themselves were Brahmin, but the people who carry forward this tradition belong to the Saiva Vedalar caste. So Oduvars are hereditary, so they exist within this caste historically, but nowadays, like, there's also a shift away from that. You can be appointed as an Oduvar even without belonging to the Saiva Vedalar caste. It's still a very niche tradition, right? Like, it's not really known much beyond the Saiva Velarla community and people who are like very deep into like Saiva Siddhanta philosophy and Saiva devotion within Tamil Nadu, but there are like movements away from having this be a caste-based practice.
Yeah, Siddharth.
Yeah, just a quick clarification on the difference between a pan and a ragam.
Yeah.
And the talam and the katalai, it looks like you were doing rupakam, was it?
Yes, this is,
So
yeah.
then how is it different from a katalai, which is
Yeah.
you said was key to how the beat is kept in the Thēvāram?
Yeah, so Katrale is not so much the beat, it's more of rhythmic patterns. So like to, do, de, ye, se, vi, yen. So like you can hear the
Like
so
a
that
Nattavangam, more like a Nattavangam?
Nattabangam is a little bit different. That's used in dance. I would say it's more, are you familiar with Tiruppugal?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of like Sandhi in Tiruppugal. Where you have that like that's more of that's the rhythmic pattern that the entire song follows. And so that's more of what Katrale refers to, whereas like the underlying beat is Taram.
It's still Talam or Rupakam.
Yeah, so Taram is not formalized really within Thēvāram. Nowadays, in the way that Thēvāram is explored in a contemporary sphere, most Odavars end up being trained in Carnatic music for at least a little bit as well. And so they stylize it by, like using Taram. And so the way that my guru taught it to me, he is an Odavar and he's extensively trained in Thēvāram, but he also is trained in Carnatic music. So like he taught it to me with Rupaka Taram as the underlying beat. To answer your questions about parns and ragas, it's a very big topic. I think parns are kind of a precursor to ragams. They're similar in that both parns and ragas have specific notes and specific nuances that are characteristic of the parn or raga. I think ragas have a little bit more formalized scales that also accompany the specific notes and the specific nuances, whereas this is not formalized as much within parns. And there's also some differences in the different usages of different like syllable lengths and meters as well that exist within parns. If we want to take a little example, there's for the ragam Kamboji, which is sa ri ga ma pa da sa ni da pa ma ga ri sa. There's two parns that correspond to it. One is Taka ragam, and the other one is Takesi. So there are two parns that correspond to this one ragam, but they're distinct parns. And I also think that some of the rules that exist within parns function a little bit differently from the way that they function within Carnatic music. So this song that I just sang is in the parn. Sorry, 1 second. Nattapade, which there's kind of a debate on whether it should be considered the equivalent to the ragam Nate or the ragam Gambhira Nate. So this particular song is pretty equivalent to the ragam Gambhira Nate, which is sa ga ma pa ni sa ni pa ma ga sa. However, Nate is sa ri ga ma pa ni sa ni pa ma ga ma re sa. So the inclusion of the second scale degree, a raised second scale degree in Nate, but in this particular song you don't hear it, but in a different song that's also in Nattapade, Vandar Kulal Arivayode Piriyavagai Bhagam, you can hear the second scale degree, the Ri. So it's still in the same parn, Nattapade, but it includes this Ri, which is more characteristic of Nate and not Gambhira Nate. So there are also some other specific differences as well between parns and their equivalent ragams.
Wow, thank you for that. Excellent. Thank you. All right, so we're going to move on to our next returning fellow. And here I would like to welcome Michael Neubauer. Please join us. A PhD candidate in economics at Brown, whose research interests include spatial, environmental, and development economics. Mike's current project investigates caste-based discrimination in rural labor markets by using experimental methods to try to disentangle factors causing different caste groups to experience different outcomes in the casual labor market. And the title of the project is Caste-Based Preferences, Social Pressure, and Statistical Discrimination in the Labor Market in Village India. So put your hands together for Michael Newbound.
Thank you. Yeah, we went with a slightly shorter version of the title for today. But so I was fortunate through the Saxena Center to be funded to go to Bihar to perform to do a pilot survey in this August. And we basically had two sort of main questions that we were looking into, or topics we were looking into. The second of which was sort of talked about in the introduction. I'll go with the second first, which was just these are areas that have fairly active rural labor markets, but that are also seeing what we call structural transformation, meaning a movement away from agriculture and towards more non-agricultural occupations. And we wanted to see how structural transformation, the rural labor markets, performed with regards to sort of caste discrimination. Okay. The first topic, which we learned about once we arrived in the field, was irrigation. So it turns out that irrigation was a really big issue in this part of India. And so we want to sort of put a caste angle on that and maybe learn more about that as well. So briefly, we surveyed 100 households in one district of Bihar. These 100 households were randomly sampled from an existing sample that one of my co-authors had created 2 years ago, and were sort of across 5 different villages. Of these 100 households, you can see that we have some variation in which caste group the households came from. Not much religious variation overall, but importantly, we do also have variation in who owns agricultural land and who does not. So it's almost 50-50 split among these 100 households. So the first topic I was going to talk about today is going to be about the irrigation and its relation to caste. So this area of Bihar is potentially interesting because there are a lot of the farmers have very small agricultural plots. So about 98% of farmers have less than 1 hectare of agricultural land, which is really a very small amount. To put it in context, I think 90+% of farms in the US are more than 10 hectares, right? So these are very small plots. And on these plots, just because of those constraints and the sort of the limited amount of capital you can generate from that plot, it's very difficult to basically raise enough money to drill an irrigation well. It's just sort of too expensive. At least on your own. It's possible that sort of neighbors could band together and through some collective action create an irrigation well, but we didn't see that all that much. Additionally, the amount of landholdings definitely varied by caste. So although again, all these average land ownings are all very small, you can see that they're much larger for people in the upper castes. And the OBC and SC landowners, of which there were relatively few already, when they did own land, they owned very little land. You can see that that's potentially why we have, I think in our sample there was one person from the OBC caste from the OBC class, who had a well, and maybe 2 people from the scheduled caste grouping who owned wells. So for these groups, it seems like maybe collective action, being able to work with your neighbors together to drill these irrigation wells might be much more important than if you came from say, an upper caste and had larger average land ownings. In addition to drilling your own well, you could sometimes rent irrigation wells from others. So typically here you'd have like a large landowner would drill an irrigation well, and then they don't need to use all the water. So they can basically run a pipe from their well to your farm and give you water for a few hours at a sort of a fixed price. Because there's such high demand for this water, like basically everyone we interviewed said, okay, yeah, we're going to do this based on first come, first serve, but like there was too much demand for the services, so they essentially had to break ties, right? And so we said, how do you break ties? And they're like, oh yeah, we'll give it to our friends or our family first, right? And so if you're in a caste group that has fewer well owners, that could really impact you, right? You may not be able to access irrigation water nearly as easily in this rental market. There's also a sort of a location element to this, which is that you, at least in this area, you can only run like a pipe from an irrigation well to to your plot for a given distance, like maybe a mile or so. After that, the leakage from the pipes is just too big to really be able to effectively irrigate your well. So if you are a small landowner and you happen to be located far from the large landowners who have the irrigation wells, it's really hard to provide that water to you. So we just asked people, and this is sort of informal, but on a scale of from 0 to 10, with 10 being the most difficult, how easy is it to access irrigation water? And you can see we did it by season, but the numbers aren't super different. You can see that in general, almost everyone found it was pretty difficult, right? 7's a pretty high number. And then there are some differences based on caste as well, with the OBC group finding it the most difficult of anyone to access irrigation water. So yeah, our takeaway here is that there's insufficient access to irrigation water overall, and especially among OBC farmers. So based on sort of these findings, what are we looking to do? Well, one thing is we could just look at sort of the spatial distribution of wells and say, are there any policies where we could potentially increase overall like village welfare while maybe decreasing the amount of water that's being used? So it might be better overall for the village if, for example, instead of a few large landowners using a lot of irrigation water, if the water was sort of more evenly used. Another possibility is we could say, okay, well, what would things look like if we just sort of distributed the wells evenly across space? We just sort of took the village and then just sort of evenly divided up the space and put an irrigation well so that everyone sort of had kind of equal access. What would that look like in terms of welfare and sort of distributional consequences? Who would it help? Whom might it hurt? And could it potentially lead to lower overall usage, so some environmental benefits? And in economics, we have these, we love these models. So we could potentially use a quantitative spatial model to try to answer some of these questions. The other approach, and the other question coming out of this is, why do we see underinvestment in irrigation wells? And specifically, do caste differences between neighboring farmers play a role? So, as I mentioned, we think that collective action to build wells together is really important. And if I'm in a different caste group or subcaste group than my neighbor, maybe it's even harder for us to sort of work together on this joint project. And one research idea there, although we really need to think about this because I think it would be very intensive to do, is to try to have some sort of randomized control trial where for people in the treatment group, we sort of nudge them or urge them to work together with their neighbors. For the people we don't provide that sort of treatment and see if there's any effects. Okay, so that was all about irrigation, which again is something we sort of learned about when we were on the ground and we weren't planning to study going in, but everyone was talking about. And so the second part is about sort of labor markets and structural transformation in caste. What we didn't realize going in was that migration, especially out-migration, has become really prevalent in Bihar, we think in the last maybe decade or so. And what this does is it means, well, there are fewer agricultural workers in the villages, and so the labor markets in the villages are really tight. And this means that the landowners seem to be essentially potentially discriminating less, at least in the labor markets, on the basis of caste, because they just wanted to find qualified workers. They didn't really care as much where you came from. They just wanted you to be able to work in the fields. And so, so this economic shock of these really tight labor markets might change attitude towards low caste groups. It could decrease caste discrimination in labor markets, and I think that's sort of what we found. And what we're interested in is whether that will translate towards changing attitudes towards caste in general or not, right? Like that might happen, things might get better, or there could also be some backlash. And so we might want to investigate this further. Thanks. Just to quantify what we meant by a sort of labor shortage, we asked landlords how long did it take at the maximum? Like what was the longest amount of time you had to look for a worker? And people were spending days trying to find workers, which in the context of these relatively small villages was quite surprising to us. In terms of sort of caste discrimination in the labor markets, there didn't seem to be much wage discrimination. So looking at average earnings by caste group, there weren't really any differences. There were some differences if you just look at agricultural work, but there the sample got a little smaller, so I wouldn't put too much sort of emphasis on that. That being said, just because there was we didn't find wage discrimination in the labor market certainly doesn't mean that caste is not an issue at all, right? And so we did still find evidence. We asked people questions about we tried to be very, how would I say it? We tried to be very sensitive about how we asked about this, but still there were definitely people who had sort of views about or were practicing untouchability or that sort of thing. So our broad research questions sort of for this part of the agenda are, do we think that migration might reduce caste disparities in the labor market and more generally? And so does like a tight labor market affect attitudes towards caste in other dimensions, such as untouchability? And then as well, what could other implications of this urban migration that is really relatively recent and labor market tightness be? It seemed to us anecdotally like a lot more farms were being managed by women because the husbands were off. I think this is like relatively new and hasn't really been studied in this context. And could it change the labor supply of other members of the migrant household? You know, if the husband is off working, might that induce the wife not to have to work as much or to work more? We also think this could vary by caste and hasn't been studied that much. So I'll end there, and please let me know if you have any feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. It's so fascinating here. I can start off with a question or two. First, on the question of water supply and water disputes. I mean, you were outlining possible policies. How interested is the state and the government in adjudicating these kind of disputes, or implementing such policies if they were helpful?
Sure. So disputes I don't know as much about.
Yeah.
In terms of policies, like it seems like the Bihar government has a policy where they said they want every farmer to have access to irrigation water in the next 5 years.
Gotcha.
So they seem very interested in this. Implementation-wise, I don't really know how that's going. We're trying to follow up sort of with some of the contacts we made.
Right.
But there's definitely some interest.
Okay. And then the other theme of your project, the kind of out-migration and labor shortage, you're saying you kind of are honing in on a regional problem that might be fairly recent. For future research, do you have a sense I imagine there might be parallels in other parts of India and South Asia with that kind of phenomenon? Just wondering if you have thought about that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so I don't know what sort of other fields think, but the consensus in economics, at least until very recently, was that compared with other developing countries, India had especially low rural to urban migration levels. And there were a number of articles published about this in the last 10 years.
Okay.
So, we went there and we saw, well, at least in Bihar, this is not really the case. And my sense is that this is changing in other areas too, but I haven't looked at any data to back that up yet. But that's sort of my suspicion that in the future it will be moving in this direction.
Understood.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions for Michael? Please.
You kind of touched on untouchability in the second half, but I was just wondering if you found evidence of locals, etc. If they were talking about, the sharing of the wells, collective action stuff, just in terms of was there any reasoning related to untouchability at all? Because that's a big political issue in India of sharing water.
Right. Yeah, so I don't think quite as much. I think there would be, if this was drinking water, I think that would be really sort of top of mind concern. I think because it's water that's used in the agricultural fields, it's not as much of an issue. But that's definitely something we can sort of try to ask more about. Yeah.
One other question.
Sure.
So also you talk about labors, how there was structural.
There
was systemic labor, in terms of a lot of manual labor. I'm guessing I think you said were done by OBC/SC.
Right.
people.
Yeah.
And so, did you see any mobility related caste discrimination, in terms of upward mobility of people who were doing this work, their dad was doing that, or their grandfather was doing that, and then the kid wanted to do some, I don't know,
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that I don't have a great answer for you, but based on the data we collected, it definitely seemed like certain subcastes within OBC were able to own increasingly large amounts of land. Not huge, right, but more than before. Whereas in the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe groups, it didn't seem like things had really changed much in the past sort of generation or two. But especially in this area of Bihar, there were a few specific, like jati in the OBC groups that had really been able to acquire a fairly large amounts of land. Yeah. Please.
In your categorizations of caste, right, you split it up into general, OBC, SC, ST, right?
Right.
And like, I'm wondering, like, within, if you have like subcaste data,
Yeah,
and
we
also
do,
like,
yeah.
are these categories contentious, or does the data like kind of problematize like this kind of specific grouping of castes?
Sure. So most of it was sort of self-reported, but there was also, so I couldn't exactly tell what was going on because I couldn't understand the language being used, right? But people would answer with their subcaste, and then our enumerators would sort of discuss among themselves what like the proper grouping was.
Okay.
That's a very good question, and I think going forward we'll try to use like because the subcast was from the respondent themselves. We'll try to sort of use that data more than necessarily the general grouping. I think the enumerators were doing it based on what they knew from the listings in the census, or I don't know if it was the census. There was a listing in the Constitution, right, of which subcaste belonged to which sort of caste groups, and that's what they were basing it off of. But I think that is something we should be paying a little more attention to.
So in the last slide, I think one of the last slides, you mentioned that there were more farms managed by women.
Yeah.
This is just interesting to know. Like, can you say a bit more about that?
So we don't, since we only have data for this one point in time, right? So we may try to look at more like other data sources to look at this. And we also, we collect the data on who the respondent was that we're talking to and their gender and so forth. And we should look more into that. But it just seemed to us that a lot of the household heads that we were talking to were women, and a lot of them were discussing how they were managing their agricultural plots, and a lot of the men were absent. And I got the sense that this was not necessarily the case in the past, but this definitely seemed to be the case today. So I don't have right now. I don't have a lot of data to back this up, but I hope to in the future.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. And now I'd like to welcome our final speaker, Nainvi Vora, PhD student in History of Art and Architecture. And Nainvi's project is called Sculpting a Presence, a South Asian female artist between the 1920s to the 1940s. Nainvi's research interests include South Asian modern art, critical theory, abstraction, psychoanalysis, women's studies, and global modernisms. And the current project proposed to interview key female sculptors, utilizing oral histories as a component of this archival project to support the wider goal of writing a history of women sculptors in modern India. So, welcome, Nainvi.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Garrity, and I want to thank the Saxena Center for giving us such amazing grants to go and explore places that we've never seen but just read about in books. This formulates a part of my larger dissertation project. And so I was just in search of archival materials relating to women artists born between, especially women sculptors, because there's a vacuum in South Asian modern art history wherein a lot of these women are not written about or they're not known. So my travels began, so this presentation is divided in two parts. Initially, I'm trying to find an aesthetic basis, and then I'm using that to sort of analyze two archival artist estates that I came upon in this region in Calcutta, which is in West Bengal, but it's on the east part of the peninsula. So my initial travels were to Shantiniketan, which is a couple of hours train ride from Calcutta, and you come to this station called Bolpur,
It is a beautiful train journey where you see the countryside of Calcutta. And I was riding around in these tuk-tuks. It was, and I've read about the Bengal school and researched it the whole of my life, but I'd never been to Shantiniketan. So my project, so I examine how art historical archives are dynamic agents in contrast to static physical records. In particular, I attempt to unpack how the archives, including diary leaves, photographs of lesser-known women sculptors, and we will see later that I will be speaking about Kiran Barua, born in the 1920s, and Uma Siddhanta, born in the 1930s, have been stalwarts in shaping South Asian modernism. These artists deployed abstraction through varied materials, going against the grain of the colonial academic tradition and reflecting upon the geopolitical context of their time. I posit that there has been a patriarchal systemic exclusion of women from history and archives, both now and across past millennia. And therefore, I feel it is so crucial to address how women artists have been active mediators and agents in shaping collective memory. So here you can see that I have entered Kala Bhavan. So Kala Bhavan is one of the foremost schools started by Rabindranath Tagore, established around the 1919. And when it was first started, it was just Kala Bhavan, then which kind of went bifurcated into Sangeeta Bhavan, which is the music section. And then upon its establishment, Rabindranath Tagore invited noted painter Nandlal Bose, who became kind of the first, who was the disciple of Abanindranath Tagore. So these Tagore brothers were all into arts and poetry, and there was no, in the larger context of Indian art history, when you think of ancient art, there's no demarcation between poetry, drama, dramaturgy, or the dance, or the natya, or kala, or kalakriti. So therefore, so basically Nandlal Bose was the first principal of this school, and which is also known as the Bengal School of Art. And then, I'm not getting too much into this, but the three pivotal figures, when you explore this place, everyone will only talk about three people, which is Binod Bihari Mukherjee. These are the artists, Nandlal Bose and Ram Kinkar Baij. But I'm questioning, where were all the women artists? And, so therefore, this is kind of this vacuum that I hope to fulfill through my research. So what you can see here is actually the house of Tagore. This is just to get an aesthetic sensibility of the place. It's really amazing, these cross-fertilizations. We can see this kind of Japanese influence in the aesthetic of, the way there's low-lying seating and in the motifs that are used in the courtyard. And this is supposed to be a Zen garden. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like it used to earlier. But it was so beautiful. You had these little, gates to enter, and it was a whole different world within a world is how I would describe it. Meeting Professor R. Sivakumar was a pivotal point in my research, who lives and resides in Shantiniketan. He's sort of retired from the organization, but he is the leading art historian of the Bengal School and also the curator of this very important exhibition in 1997 called The Making of a Contextual Modernism. And of course, within this exhibition, only 4 male artists were highlighted. And those 4 male artists are Nandlal Bose, of course, Rabindranath Tagore himself, Ram Kinkar Baij, and Binod Bihari Mukherjee. What I gained from recording these oral histories, because Professor Sivakumar became an archive for me, literally. So when I was recording, this is his home. It's beautiful. And what I want to say is that according to, I'm quoting Sivakumar, that the Shantiniketan artists were one of the first who consciously challenged the idea of modernism by opting out of both internationalist modernism and historicist indigenous and indigeneity, and tried to create a context-sensitive modernism. And that's why the title of his curated exhibition is called The Making of a Contextual Modernism. And so basically he's trying to say that they're creating a language of their own. Even if you see all these cross-fertilizations and all this kind of influence from the internationalism, still what he's trying to say is it's very much a modernity on its own, which I'm trying to portray. So this is the aesthetic that I'm trying to establish, which is of the sculptor Ram Kinkar Baij. This is a particular sculpture called the Mill Call. These are really important. I think the government just realized that these are national treasures. So suddenly there are all these fences that have come. And earlier you could just walk past them. But it was interesting. I had to peek through a fence to see it. There are like nine artists that come under the National Treasure Act. I'm not getting into that right now. But this is a very important sculpture which forms the basis of my research. It's called the Santhal family. So it depicts the Santhal couple with their child and dog. As you can see, it's very dynamic. It has a very expressive quality to it. They're carrying all their possessions with them to settle elsewhere and start a new life. So the Santhal people, as you may know, are the indigenous people of this land, and they're the largest tribe. I shouldn't use this word tribe, but they're the largest tribe in the states of Jharkhand and West Bengal. What you can see is this very earthly, organic quality of the textures and the figures that embody a kind of empathy or humility. And this is what Ram Kinkar Baij was all about. And now I'm just directly going to go. These are just images from the campus of Kala Bhavan. This is another aesthetic of Nandlal Bose that also is very important. Because he was very influenced by the frescoes and the sculptures of the Ajanta and Ellora caves, which you can definitely see in these reliefs that are all over the campus. This campus itself is high modernism. I mean, walking around it is an experience of the senses. Like you will pass by like murals on the wall created by Nandlal Bose, who's, national treasure. So these are the wonderful things you come across the campus. And this is just during the dusk. It was a beautiful moment. There was also a very engaging afterlife for the students. Here Sivakumarji is speaking with all the students relating to another exhibition. But going back to the Baij aesthetic, the Ram King, that expressive quality, I want to just touch upon really quickly two very important female sculptors. One is Kiran Barua and the other one is Uma Siddhant. After speaking to I don't know how many people, I found this unbelievably untouched archive of Kiran Barua. That's her son and the family estate that this woman was legendary. Reason being that she was born in Assam, but she graduated from Kala Bhavan herself under Ram Kinkar Baij in so she basically imbibed this aesthetic to create these sculptures, which are so much in sync with what Baij was doing. She actually went to Europe and to studied at the school in Paris under this Russian French sculptor Osip Zatkin, and she stayed there for 2 years. She met famous artists like Matisse, Brancusi, Marc Chagall, And when she came back, this is the cross-fertilization that happens. Basically, this is her pottery on the top. So besides sculpture, she also did pottery. So what you see is on the top left, that is what she did before she came back. And then she was very influenced by Picasso as well. She couldn't meet Picasso though, but she got a book signed by him through a friend or something. But what you see in between is a recent Christie's auction in which you have the pottery that Picasso created at Velouris, which is in southeastern France, between 1947 and 1955. This is what influenced her. And on the right is what she created afterwards, after she came back. So on the left is this indigenous primitive aesthetic, but on the right is this very, I don't want to use the word international, but international aesthetic imbibing from Picasso. And so it's kind of a global modernism. And the lastly is this other woman artist. Her name is Uma Siddhant. Unfortunately, when I met her, she's in her 90s and she had dementia. So she couldn't tell me anything or even know who I am or understand who I am. But she's gotten a lot of accolades, as you can see. I love the expressive quality in her works as well. They're very different because she didn't directly learn under Ramkinkar Baij, but this is her home. Her entire home was an archive. It was 4 floors full of sculptures. She's not known, she's not written about. And there's a lot of influence, different kinds of influences within these sculptures. I don't have time to, this is basically my larger dissertation project. So, but these are just, thank you so much.
Thank you. Excellent. I mean, so wonderful to learn about all of this amazing art, right? It's
Right.
very, very cool. Can you say something a little bit more about the kind of what the professor was calling kind of contextual modernism versus this kind of European or international modernism? Because I'm trying to kind of parse out how those two categories relate. Because on the one hand, I hear what you're saying, that it's a very specific, locally rooted aesthetic, right, as evidenced by the campus. But then the other hand, you're telling me about these trips to Europe, and you can't help but see echoes of European modernism in the work itself, right? Whether it's direct or implicit. So just curious about how you see those two categories.
Yeah, I think different artists had different levels of exposure. Uma Siddhant never, I don't think she ventured abroad.
Okay.
She largely lived her life within India, and she became a teacher later on. And she's based in Calcutta as compared to Kiran Barua ji, who was more, exposed. In fact, in the photograph on the bottom right, she's on a delegation through the Communist Party of India to Warsaw, Poland.
I see. Okay.
And so this woman has larger underpinnings, like a context of socio-political undercurrents in her work, which are very relevant, I think, and therefore I use probably for her work this term internationalism. Maybe for Uma Siddhant, I would contextualize it more through a sculptor called Pradosh Das Gupta, because he was the principal of the Rabindra Bharati University in Calcutta, where she studied. So I think they're very nuanced in their own way, but it's great that, and they're from different regions, right? And I mean, she's from Calcutta, and then she's from Shantiniketan, so
I see.
I guess I would approach them differently.
Understood, yeah. Well, and congratulations in terms of the prospects for your dissertation research. It sounds like you've encountered just amazing network and resources and archives, so that's very exciting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot more to be done.
I'm sure. Oh, that's often the case, right?
Yeah.
Questions for 9B?
It's so different than everyone's. It's so visual, I think,
Well,
as
nice.
compared to data,
Right.
and
No, but it's
and
nice.
a lot of graphs. So.
It's nice to have a range, for sure, and you're teaching us a lot about these unsung, geniuses of that art
Yeah.
scene.
In fact, it's really, so I met her son.
Mm-hmm.
Her son was the spokesperson for me because she spoke in Bengali and I can't understand or speak Bengali.
Right.
But her son was trying to tell me that she was one of the foremost women to enroll in the sculpting department because
Okay.
only men were allowed in sculpting because they felt women couldn't handle the laborious, the weight of the material and all of this.
Yeah.
Although and you can see some of her sculptures are pretty large scale.
Yeah, very much.
Like they don't look large in the photographs,
Yeah.
and they're bronze casting. Some of them are bronze casting and heavy metal sculptures.
Yeah.
But I think she defied.
Yeah.
She said that this is what I want to do.
Right.
So
Fascinating.
yeah.
Wow. Well, I'd say that sexism is still a legacy in kind of sculpture internationally. I mean, if you just look at the known sculptors, there is this kind of macho, masculine quality to a lot of their presentation. Modernist sculptures.
I was just looking at Barbara Hepworth.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah,
Very
and
cool.
and like she has, I don't know, she has a very organic, a very humane quality to her sculptures.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think some of these other women, not the ones I've spoken about here, but they kind of take from her aesthetic.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Navdeep.
Okay, thanks so much.
And thank you all for your attention, for the amazing work that you all have done. It's so exciting to imagine these projects going into the future, because as you said, there's a lot more to be done, right? So, I mean, please have some food. There's some food out in the hall, and we can talk a little bit more. But yeah, I really enjoyed this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course, yeah. And whose phone is this? Someone left their. Okay, good. The whole time you've probably been